Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I am Sid Part 2, joining me today is...
A Geek for Fun.
Indeed. And we are doing another episode of Geeky Gentlemen History Month, where we continue to discuss the contributions that Geeky Gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by a biased educational system, except not at all. And today we're doing a topic discussion. History Month topic discussions always very weighty. So what are we talking about today, Alfie?
Today we're going to be talking about something actually suggested to me by my lovely, beautiful wife Erin, which is the idea of. Let me get the exact way of phrasing this. We have to talk to her about like how this would be phrased because it's kind of a broad topic. Depictions of historical tragedies being watered down, changed, adapted, framed towards sympathy. And like that can, I guess, have fun with finding a catchy title for that. Sorry,
Thanks.
But like, it's just because it is a broader topic where the example we're gonna go with is in history class when I was in school. And this is like secondary school, so it's like when I was around like 13, 14. So old enough to understand more about history, but still kind of like a kid. And like how we'd often get taught about the Holocaust was through movies. The most primary example of one of that in the UK is The Boy in Striped Pajamas. Is like the majority of like how people get informed about the Holocaust, and that's kind of it. And then no more talks about it. And that's how most people get, like, the vague beats of it. Like, people know it was a thing that happened. Sadly, even that these days is getting a little harder to prove for some people. But you start getting into the weeds of things and, like, people's views of Nazis as also partly victims. And these kind of things of what the focus is and, like, the myths built around what actual history was. Over time, when that is people only interaction with a historical event, that could lead to very harmful views in terms of things repeating themselves or things being viewed as like being blown out of proportion or this didn't happen like that, etc. And I think with history, and concerningly more and more these days, that's becoming just frustratingly common talking point of having to debunk these things for people, or even things you just don't know yourself, of just because you consume media about it is how you mostly learn about these things. So very long ramble, but I think it's a topic that's worthwhile discussion, and you can go in a lot of directions with it.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, so that's a little more broad than I feel what you like initially pitched, because you were like how, particularly you were talking about how the perpetrators get portrayed sympathetically,
Right.
which certainly happens, but like I feel like that's a lot narrower than just the broader like question. I think I'm gonna supersede and go for the broader thing because I think we'll have more to talk about doing it this way, which is just watering down historical events. I think that is absolutely something that we see just across the board in media, is the way that historical happenings are watered down, not just in media too, within like the way in which history is taught. God, I can't Chelsea Handler is maybe her name. I can't remember her name, but it was like basically a female actress. I think she may have been like a comedian that kind of got big because she was one of the first people to like post pictures of her boobs on Instagram, right? Um, and she's not really like proper famous, but she's known a bit, and she's not like a particularly well educated person. But she does this series for, I want to say it was Netflix or HBO, where she just goes around the country and interviews different people about different things. And one of the episodes she did, she went to the South, right? She started interviewing people and asked them questions about things. And it was very fascinating to watch because she is a white woman of somewhat note, but in a way that is like trusted. Not like a Jon Stewart or something like that, right? Where it's like, oh, the liberal, right? So she'd talk to these people from the South, and they would say things that just, you knew that was 100% what they believed, no bullshit, because they felt safe talking to her in a way they wouldn't with, like, you know, a proper journalist or whatever. And one of the things that they told her was like, oh, you know, like the way slavery is treated is just absolutely blown out of proportion by media. Like, you know, if I bought a tractor, I'm going to treat that tractor nice. If I bought a brand new tractor, spent all this money on it, I'm not going to start beating up on and destroying my tractor. That's an investment to me. And that's how the slaves were treated. And I'm just like, holy fucking shit, no. Where did you learn this, you son of a bitch? And there's a lot of stuff like that. One of the other ones I really liked is she got a hold of a history book from like the 1950s or something, and like there's a whole section about how great slavery was in America for both the slaves and the slave owners back before the War of Northern Aggression shut it down. And I'm like, Jesus fucking, of course people have fucking twisted ass views if this is the way they were taught things. Fuck. It's terrifying, Elfie. I'm scared.
No, it is. It's one of those things where you don't really start to see it until like 20 years after the fact, or even sometimes in cases 30 instances. But let's say just 20, I think is a round thing. Let's say someone gets taught this when they're 10 years old. By the time they're 30 is normally when they'll start being people, like if they're writers in careers or if they're TV personalities or something. That's normally when you'll see people like on television and stuff. Sometimes you'll get younger 20s if like they're more radical people, or in this case where we now have YouTubers and social medias often pretend to be on the younger scale, and so you'll see like more people like that sometimes in these cases, but normally 30, 40 is when you'll see the effects. So these would be people that were taught in the 90s at this point, or the 80s, where it seems at the time just, oh, whatever. It takes that, there's such a lag in terms of what the education system will lead to the end result of like when these people are actually making these decisions and informing people. And I feel like now we're hitting like that lag where our culture has evolved to a point where we're more critical of these things and more aware of these things, but the people that grew up in this way haven't caught up to that yet. So like there's a clash that we're seeing now, which is more prevalent, which has always existed, but it's definitely the most heightened it's ever been now because of the internet and all that kind of things.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And it is just really interesting how there has been and continues to be such an attempt to in educating people about history to frame things in very particular ways. So like a good example, I guess to stick with slavery, is I remember being taught that Washington and Jefferson and a lot of the founding fathers of America owned slaves. But that information was always accompanied with like just a whole lot of spin and like additional information to try to like soften the blow and make it better and stuff. And so it's like, yeah, Washington was a slave owner, but in his heart he knew it was wrong, so he arranged for after his death to have all his slaves released, and he made sure that that he treated his slaves really well and didn't separate families like a lot of slaves had to deal with. And it's like all these things to try to soften the blow. And while Washington may not have been the worst slave owner, I'm gonna take my radical stance here of only good slave owner is a dead one, right? Like I don't think you could be a good person and a slave owner. And it was just I don't care if that was the attitude at the time. It's just someone knew it was wrong. It was fucking slaves. So it's really interesting how when we're taught these things growing up, that they're often coded in a particular way. Something I found really fascinating that I've learned kind of recently is Japanese people, by and large, are not educated on what happened leading up to World War II. It like there's this weird gap almost in Japanese textbook education for the vast majority of the public, where Japan seems to have gone from an isolationist nation to begin to open up and modernize to the world to getting bombed for absolutely no reason by America. And then becoming an incredibly successful economy after the fact because of that. There's just this huge gap where a lot of Japan is not taught about Japan's militaristic and imperialist actions in the lead up to World War II and its actions in World War II. So and of course this is also worth noting that Japan, I think they recently, not recently, maybe 10 years ago or so, finally said sorry to China for the atrocities that they committed, and nothing else. That was about the extent of it. So it is really fascinating to the point where there are people serving in the upper reaches of Japanese government that straight up just do not believe that Japan ever did anything of morally questionable circumstances in World War II. I should caveat all of this. That doesn't mean dropping a nuclear bomb was a good idea or necessarily justified. But still, it's kind of fucked up.
I think it's just again this idea of the it's not even necessarily history being written by the victors. It's just history being written by the people of the place you're currently in. And that's not the case all the time. Say if you're an occupied state or puppet governments or any number of things where you don't have control of your own history and is purposely misled and lied to you, especially if you're not the majority race in power or sexuality in power, then your history will often always be dictated by other people. But say you're me, for example, white middle class guy in England, then yes, well, maybe not middle class, but the rich elite are definitely going to be writing the history to make ourselves look like the good guys. Like that's often the joke I see all the time about how English history books are very much just like, anyway, a bunch of wars happened. Anywho, and then like every other history book in the world, England was the bad guy. It's really, really funny. Just how much of that is put under the rug, and like we talked about this in the Vincent and the Look thing about like people like Churchill, are often used in this almost monolithic, like very good. It's the best example we could have to someone like Washington, right? It's those kind of figures, and often just the simple fact of people are people. You're not really gonna have any figure who is gonna reach the standards set by what we want them to be or how we portray them in media, The thing I want to kind of focus on, so I don't get too far away from what I think is some meat of it, is example given in the Boy Striped for his armors and why that's so harmful is the idea of in that film, for people who haven't watched it, or in the book as well, the main character is the son of a high-ranking Nazi official, and in the story, the entire premise of it is him being oblivious of the Holocaust and him being oblivious of what Jews are and all of this, so he can be the audience POV and go in with no bias. And then throughout the movie, like form this friendship with the young Jewish boy, and then have like a tragedy at the end, and the child being viewed as also a victim of this German state and stuff like that. That's just blatantly false. If you're a young child of a high-ranking Nazi official, you would be in Hitler Youth. Absolutely. You would know exactly what the Holocaust was, and you would be the one who was more diehard for it than probably your father was. So that's an example of it works really well for an emotional story, right? For a fictionalized event. But when you're teaching children this is what happened in the Holocaust, I think that does lead to why a lot of things lean towards the idea of like Nazi soldiers, for example, being just following orders or being misguided. And I think them going beyond the Holocaust, that's a very common trend of when we humanize oppressors to the extent where we kind of it's like oh they didn't know what they were doing. It's only in hindsight that we knew this was bad. And I think that's a very, very harmful thing because it kind of excuses atrocities that are happening around you at the moment, and like the idea of like, well, you don't have to do anything because you're just as it's like this horrible event that just happened. It's not a result of people's inaction, and I think that's something that really, really can put people off and like their moral like stances.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting to see how we try to portray these things, and the humanization of the oppressors is one of those things where I'm honestly a little bit torn on it, because I think there is a strength in humanizing them to a point in which Nazis are a really good example, because Nazis have kind of just become history's bad guy, more or less. Because, I mean, just objectively, they're like, if you were to create a cartoon villain, it'd be hard to not get super close to the Nazis. Like, they wore fucking skulls on their hats, right? Like, Jesus Christ. It's like so perfectly evil. Are we the baddies? Like, there's a lot there that's just absolutely 100% morally wrong. But the problem is, because they've become so like blatantly the go-to baddie, there's almost like a power in that, like, that softens the image as this cartoonishly evil, over the top, so it's almost like fictional and hard to believe. So going through and doing something that tries to focus on just one person who was a Nazi and had, moral crises about what they were doing. There's some level of something to say there, and maybe to make it feel more real and feel more believable. But I think the difficulty in doing so is you got to walk a really fine line where you don't just absolve that person of what they're doing, what they're contributing to. And I think that makes things, kind of awkward to dance around, because we were talking about this a couple months back, where it was just tiers of writing and like how difficult something is to pull off as your skill as a writer, right? Like make a Nazi character sympathetic without absolving them of their wrongs. Good fucking luck with that. That is not a challenge I would readily be willing to take on.
Is there anything with you that? Because I agree with you as well. Like it's when you're coming to humanizing, that you are just like these people were human beings, right? And that you can get a fascinating idea from terrible human beings, and not even cartoon characters. Like real people aren't going to spend every single waking second of their day being cartoonishly monstrous. There are going to be places of them you can show where, like, oh, they're just like a normal person, right? Like, you can do that for literally anyone through history. Like, if you showed Hitler on the shitter, most people, oh, he's just shitty like a. He probably shat weird as well, honestly. I'm not gonna lie. But like, there's that idea, right, of like when you are a filmmaker, you are or anyone with media, you're writing a book, you get to choose what parts you get to focus on, and by doing that to real historical people or even fictional people put in a historical setting, you get to dictate what the audience takes away from that setting, right? Like if you put someone in a really brutal battle scene and that's your opening scene, you can get different takeaways from that, but it's mostly going to be like an action takeaway. Whereas if you start like a family dinner scene as your opening, you can inform, oh, that this person's nice, like they're nice to their children or whatever, and then show horrific acts. You're going to still be framing it in a very sympathetic light, even if you're pulling the rug from people's from underneath people. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this, and I think the responsibility just falls to storytellers who are doing this. Just need to be aware of what they're doing and how a lot of historical kind of Oscar bait films are meant as just entertainment get turned into educational pieces.
Yep.
And how the educational system often just uses movies to inform students, even if the filmmaker never intended that. And I feel like that's a really difficult and harmful balance there.
Yes, no, I think that is entirely a fair point because, yeah, it's just public schools are a completely different discussion topic, but they're not exactly the best forms of education, and sometimes media is a good way, in some instances, to get something across because art has that ability to hit on a level that reading it in a book doesn't. Like, Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Okay. On some level, just that statement read in a book, I understand. Whereas you show me in a movie, like, people being processed through Auschwitz and then immediately shuffled into the gas chamber, like half of them, and you just sit there and you watch people suffocate for like a 3-4 minute sequence. Now I get that, you know, like those are two very distinct things, and they have very distinct impact on you. Man, these fucking heavy episodes.
I mean, it is, but then again, Ian, like you decide to have a history month, and history pretty be heavy.
Yeah, I know, right? Sorry, I just like fucking like just to sit there describing it, and I'm like remembering the scenes. I'm like, yeah, that was a fucked up movie I watched when I was in like fucking high school. I think they should have prepared me better for what I was about to see.
You I guess a question I would do, like, and I guess on a somewhat of a lighter note, are there ways, I guess, I think another example of something, a film that, like, I think tried to do this, and you can argue if it succeeded. Have you ever seen Jojo Rabbit, Ian?
Mm-hmm.
So that film tries to do the Nazi painted a different light thing by portraying them as bumbling. and just like incompetent, and that can lead to humor and like and making fun of them, but that can also lead to the idea of again like, oh, they didn't know what they were doing, thing. Like, do you think they're when we're making fun of people, and I suppose just me talking about Nazis all fucking episode.
That's fine.
It's just the easiest thing that comes to mind.
It's the go-to. They're the bad guys of history.
Right, but do you think doing that also has like a negative connotation, like in terms of just like again like absolving guilt through stupidity and like lack of awareness, or do you think that's a different thing altogether?
See, I don't know. I guess, like, I can see the argument for how that would, or how you could construe it that way. Though I would just posit, like, immediately in the same breath, I don't think that's what Jojo Rabbit did. Because, like, the Nazi staff, the Nazi, like, the Gestapo agents, the Nazi soldiers we see in Jojo Rabbit, they're really not bumbling and incompetent. There's like a couple funny scenes with them that just kind of like poke fun at some of the habits that the Nazis had. Like when all the guys are walking into the house and they say Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, and like another guy walks to the room and they all go through it again, right? Like that is a funny scene. But it's like actually based on something that Nazis did. Brief diversion to another historical film. What was it? Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing, The Enigma Machine or something like that. I'm trying to remember the name of the movie. Anyway, in that they're sitting there trying to create this computer to crack the German Enigma machine that's like all their coded messages go through, and the way they solve it, and this is it's somewhat historically accurate. It's blown a little out of proportion in the movie, but the way they solve it is every message ends with fucking Heil Hitler. So that's the Nazis provided the own source for breaking their code because of their intense devotion to the word Heil Hitler, right? But back to the Jojo Rabbit point, back to the thing of like, is showing the Nazis being like bumbling and kind of incompetent, is that does that absolve them of things? And I'd say no, at least in the case of Jojo Rabbit, because I think that what they show the Nazis do is they play up a couple scenes for humor, but ultimately everything that they do in that movie is like they're pretty damn proficient at, and that's the scary, dramatic, serious parts of the movie, right? Like his mother is a ally to Jewish people trying to shelter and smuggle and save people and trying to help as some form of internal resistance in the war. And she dies by the end of that movie, and not like by accident or like happenstance. Like they find and they kill her. And even when it doesn't matter, even when they know they're losing, they find and they kill her. And that's the proficiency, that's the scary part of them. Like, yeah, they could be bumbling, they could make mistakes. There's plenty of examples of mistakes that the Nazis made, and like so many survival stories are predicated on those mistakes. But that's the nature of it again. Like, and that's what makes Nazis scary, of course, is they were people and they were capable of all that. And they were also capable of making mistakes, and you kind of thank everything there is that they did make so many mistakes. And sometimes there's some humor to be had in that. I don't know. It's a complicated issue. Do I think you could do it in a way that would be too cartoonish or too ridiculous and kind of do what you were saying of absolving them by showing, oh, they didn't really know what they were doing? Possibly, but I guess I struggle to think of an example where I feel like that happened. The most buffoonish, bumbling Nazi character I can think of in media is in The Producers, and he's like a Nazi 20 years after the fact that wasn't actually, that was like, supposed to have been a kid at the time kind of thing, and it's all played for comedy. Um, fucking Mel Brooks also wrote it, so make of that what you will. Um, do you have a different example where you think that maybe they overshot on that, or nah?
No, because I tend to agree with you in general. I just think it's like something where it's something I see a lot, so I was just wondering on your take on it. But I'm with you where I do think there is actually a legitimate basis for comedy in that, but comedy that can also be used in a very informative way. Um, and I think that's also a good education tool for children. Is I don't know about you, but like anytime I saw bigots or people being treated as like idiots or fools in like comics or movies or anything like that, it very much like, oh yeah, that's something an idiot thinks. And smart people
Mm-hmm.
don't think like that. Like that was actually quite effective for me as a child. I'd be like, oh yeah, it'd be stupid to discriminate people like that because that's what the stupid people do. And I don't want
I
to be
mean,
a stupid
to
person.
to get us off of Holocaust, I think like a really good example of what you're talking about there, that kind of waters down what the Klan was about, but in a way that I think was probably more of a death blow than any other act against the Klan in this country's history. Um, was the Superman radio drama? Did the episode on the Klan, and the big reveal in that one is that the guy running it, for that episode, the guy running that chapter of the Klan or whatever it was, is just doing it for the money. He's doing it to sell memberships and robes, and like, I don't really give a shit about whether or not black people like count as human beings. None of that really matters. It's just about the money that I can get from these rubes that I trick into joining up for this membership so they can feel better and superior. And then Superman busts it all up, right? Like, that audio drama being broadcast across the nation fucking just put that idea of the charlatan nature of benefiting and growing wealth off of racist bigotry and shit like that. It just fucking for a generation was the biggest blow to the Klan. And clearly we needed like some re-ups of that lesson that I guess never quite happened. But damn, it was something.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I think that's a good example where the the hiding of certain aspects does make it more palatable for children, and in that way where you're going to be showing these things to people at a young age, which I do think is important, where to let kids know when they're that impressionable, like a firm stance on like what right and wrong is. I think that is a
Mm-hmm.
very good thing to do. Obviously you shouldn't be showing them those graphic things, but knowing that these people hurt people and you shouldn't treat the other kids in your classmate if they are different skin colors or identify differently, like you should treat them with respect and stuff. And there's a lot of younger children's shows that are coming out these days which do really good jobs at being open about that, with like trans teachers and stuff. Like they face a lot of struggles with kids not knowing how to interact with them, not because of the kids' fault, but because their parents will specifically like make them forced after them and such. So I think examples like that, using characters like Superman in that bad guy way, while like you said, making them, showing the hollowness of it, showing the absolute lack of any commitment to an idea beyond just angry people looking for an excuse to be angry and to hate and to kill, and like that very base awful realm, I think is something to always showcase in like a very negative light. I think it works really well. One example that I think, kind of moving away from these larger scale ones, how do you feel about the recent trend with like true crime shows? And we kind of talked about this a little bit in the previous episode, but the idea that um, showing like serial killers in a sympathetic light from like their childhood and stuff, like shows that focus on serial or movies that necessarily focus on that type of person.
It's such a weird thing because I definitely went through this to an effect growing up and like in being a teenager and stuff, where I think there is just a fundamental like curiosity about serial killers that some people have, and just that it's almost very like voyeuristic, kind of come see the freak show kind of base base feeling, where you just it's just so different and so foreign to how anyone like should think, I guess, that you kind of can't help but look. It's a fucking like accident on the side of the road, right? Like, yeah, you shouldn't slow down and turn to look at it, but your monkey brain is bad at doing what you shouldn't do. um, so like you kind of there's like kind of that fascination, and I think it is just a matter of fact. A lot of the people that go off and become serial killers or commit horrible crimes tend to, you know, it correlates well with having a really fucked up childhood. It's not all of them. There are certainly fucking who's the guy with the show right now? Bundy?
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Dahmer had a pretty good childhood from everything I've ever read, and like I even remember an interview with Dahmer in prison, and his dad's sitting right next to him, and they're still talking just like, you know, regular old father and son. It's like very bizarre. So there is that, like, if you're going to make something that people are just inherently fascinated by for whatever reason, and you're going to show their life, yeah, it feels like it would be remiss not to show that part, if that could be kind of that avenue, that explanation for why they are this way, or at least a part of the answer. But yeah, you can go too far with it, and it's a difficult situation to be in, and that's kind of just why I don't think I would ever want to put myself in this situation. How do you show, like, let's say you're making a film about someone's real life, and this is a serial killer. How do you show someone being abused as a child and not make it so you feel sympathy for them? That's a really hard question to answer.
Right, it is. It's one of those things. It's one of
like,
those
I think the only answer has to be you don't make that movie, right? Like,
yeah.
Or
you cut that scene and you just, I think, just have them as an adult mention it offhand.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an easier way to, because you know, people get sick of hearing Batman's like, "Oh, my parents died as a child." I think if people get a lot less sympathetic to that once they see the grown person who's still talking about it, and that's still a valid thing to talk about, especially like in real life. Like, trauma is still completely fine, but just in terms of what an audience responds to, I do think people tend to be less sympathetic to people who use that as a justification to then abuse children themselves or to attack people in general. I think that's normally how you get away with that. But if you are like showing the scene like flashback style, or even just like that's the opening of the film, is chronologically kid gets beat and you see a child actor get hit, and yeah, kind of impossible to not like at least get like, okay, this is how this kid got fucked up.
Mm-hmm. And of course, again, there are people that have gone out and committed horrific crimes, and they had just marvelous childhoods. Like it's not just that one thing, and of course there are people who had awful childhoods that are great, upstanding individuals that don't go out and, you know, murder hundreds. It is just one of those things where it's like it's very, very particularly difficult to do, and at the same time Should we be doing it? I don't fucking know. Like, there's a whole conversation going on right now about, in regards specifically to the Netflix Dahmer show, which I'm not fucking watching because I'm past that point in my life where that fascinates me. But there's a conversation of like, oh, well, this is being made without any consideration for the victims or the survivors' families, and I'm like, yeah, no, I get how if you're the survivor of this, serial killer or whatever, that could be very traumatic to just, get home from work one day, you turn on Netflix, and there's, your story up on screen without any notice. That's fucking terrible. But at the same time, I don't think that in and of itself is enough of a justification for me to say we shouldn't tell these stories, we can't tell these stories. I think that's just an argument for we should maybe be more considerate about when and how we tell these stories. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that's my weird hot take for the latest Twitter drama, but I don't know. That's something I've been seeing the takes flying back and forth on, and I'm the odd man out again.
No, I'm tend to agree with you again when I think like any writer's job opportunity is always to just ask the how. That's your job, right? Like that's why you get paid, is hopefully to be able to figure out these questions. And if we had the answers to all of these things, like we wouldn't continue to be fascinated by them. I think the reason why we get so attracted to these stories is that kind of danger around it. Like I think a lot of writers actually really do like kind of the idea of being controversial. And so by touching the material and like seeing if they can make it work, sometimes for reasons that are entirely from an artistic point of view, it's like painting a horrific image, right, of like a horrific historical tragedy is like touching it is kind of taboo, but that kind of gets attention, and there's maybe some kind of value in messing with these taboos. I mean, if we didn't, we'd be stuck in a very, very repressed society for a lot of things that were once considered taboo, like to make stories about, which now are very important to people. Now, I don't think the serial killer community really needs that much things, but it's a common example, right, of like things where I can understand the artistic need for doing it. It's just more plainly that a lot of these reasons are just made entirely like monetarily. Like a lot of these choices are just made because it's the hot fad. It's the trend that resurges now and again. And I think the same thing happens for those type of films. To go back to the Boy in the Striped Pajamas example, and even in the books that then become films, is it's kind of just a Hollywood machine to have a book set in a very prominent historical period, have it deal with subject matter like that, and then have it get made into a film that's been based off a book. And that's kind of like the tried and true formula for like Oscar bait movies. And I think a lot of that is kind of blatantly rooted in a lot of anti-Semitism, in terms of like what choice of films got to get made, and even the people making those films going onwards, the idea that Jewish pain has like become such a fucking like hot bucket, like we can make a lot of cash off of this, is a real issue. And I think the same thing goes for the black community, in terms of like the only films that really get big green light and big money attached to it for black people are civil rights era films or slavery related films, where that's the only historical part of their history you can focus on is the pain. And so by doing that, when those are the only things you're making, eventually, just in terms of the characters you're going to be putting in those films, you're going to have the oppressors and the white people and all these kind of things. As a writer, I can understand being like, well, maybe I'd want to give this character a little bit more depth because I want to write a good film or write a good script. It just becomes the responsibility of like, hey, you're not really doing the point of the film here, or of terms of what could actually be used by doing good here. This character doesn't need any depth, because quite frankly, as we've learned again and again, as we've gotten like more and more seeped into how the political climate currently is, not a lot of depth on that side. Really, actually, not surprisingly little. In fact, like I think everyone, especially like in that period in like the 80s and 90s, when we were making a lot of these films, like the early 2000s, I think a lot of filmmakers gave like racists too much credit. Like, and I think we, as an audience, expected better of bigots. Like, well, they've got to have something they're doing this for, right? Like, there's got to be some kind of like backstory, or there's got to be some kind of like, well, they didn't know the extent of it. They thought, oh, we could just segregation. They didn't want murder and all of that. And then you like go on Twitter and you'll see people being like, "Oh, I hope trans genocide happens," and then you're like, "No, they just want to kill people that aren't like them. That's it. That's literally all there is to them." And that just doesn't making films that focus on those people just isn't very entertaining. It just kind of makes you angry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of just breaking it down. Is you as a like what we as an audience. Let's go with that. What we as an audience are used to is complex characters with multifaceted layers of motivation. And sometimes people just aren't like that, you know? When you're writing history or historical based things, yeah, no, sometimes people are just fucking evil, and unfortunately that's just not interesting enough on its own. Um, it's a unique problem to have. But I think importantly, it's not like necessarily a new problem. I think a really good example of this is like Julius Caesar's, or not Julius Caesar's, Shakespeare's histories, like Julius Caesar, where like he tries to add like a lot of depth and a lot of shit that just didn't fucking happen into those plays to like make them more dramatic. And unfortunately, people have like gone through life thinking that the Shakespeare play is like really well researched and really accurate to the events of the life and times of Julius Caesar. And it's not. I mean, because Shakespeare didn't give a fuck. He cared about what he was writing. He didn't give a fuck about what actually happened. He just thought, like, he just inspired by the life of Julius Caesar. Is I think a good example of that. Where sometimes I think writers just want to kind of get away with that a little bit more. And because of a really bad educational system, we writers are expected to have done more research and know more than like the history books are. Like there's more here's the word I wanted. There is more scrutiny put on the writer of a fictional story set in a historical period than there is on the textbooks we are giving to children in schools. I think that is just fundamentally true and terrifying. Because I don't know, sometimes it is kind of fun to just set something in an era and not really worry about how accurate it is, but just to have like the vibe of those eras. And sometimes you can get away with it and it works. Like I liked that in the Johnny Depp Pirates movies. Those are fun. It's set in a historical era. All the facts are fucking wrong, but I don't care. It's fun. You know, it's cool. There's fucking squid face guy, Davy Jones. You know, it's cool. It's fun. The trappings of the era, the aesthetic of the ships and the costumes. That's fun. That's cool. God, I would not want to have to fucking deal with the real world politics and the actual like background for the things that existed in that time period. That sounds exhausting. If I were to try to write something in that era, but I'd write it. I could write a pretty good Johnny Depp's Pirates movie.
Yeah, and I think that's something where being able to explore that. I mean, we wrote our entire thing about bombshells, right? and you did a very good job in order to like making it actually about like the people of that time and just like it is still relevant today. But like Nazis weren't making live wire, so like there was
They
a
would if they could have. I'll tell you
would have
that.
they would if they could have, that's for sure. But the Saiyans from Planet Sadala weren't down
Sedala.
Sadala. They weren't causing a ruckus in Brooklyn, so but like you can play in those environments and you can have different kinds of villains and like the Pirates of the Caribbean example. One franchise I really liked that did it a lot was Assassin's Creed.
Mm.
Because I think Assassin's Creed, especially early on, before they, I don't know what they're doing now. They've got like really fantasy in the modern games, but when Assassin's Creed, those first three games did a really great premise of going through history with the implicit thing that you're going through your ancestors' memories, but also it's like this almost like it's this weird can't it's not time travel, but you're not really in the real past, and it implicitly starts out in a fake future. So you can kind of get more leeway by saying, "Oh, these historical figures were actually members of this evil organization," and you can go and kill them and fight them, and you can be involved in history. And like Assassin's Creed 3 is set in the American Revolution. No, it's not the Revolution. It's the Civil War. Sorry, it's set in the Civil War where you can fight on different sides and stuff, and you can see like certain historical figures as like bad guys that you get to kill, even though they didn't die like that. But premise is implicitly, yeah, right. It's implicitly.
I'm sorry. It's just. I didn't, for one, I did not know that Assassin's Creed had any game set in the American Civil War. For two, how the fuck you gonna make a game called Assassin's Creed set in the American Civil War and not get to kill Abraham Lincoln? Like the fuck?
I think he's like already dead prior to that point.
Cowards. Should have. I want to fucking murder Abe Lincoln. Goddammit. This is bullshit. One of the most famous assassinations in history in the game about assassins in history, and you don't get to do it. Cowards, Alfie.
Apparently there is.
This is what happens to this is what happens with the woke media.
Actually, you know what?
Oh, do you? Do you for real get to kill Abraham Lincoln?
I forgot this part was here. So there's a prologue mission where you play as the assassin's dad, who's like a bad guy, and like the first mission is killing Lincoln.
Okay, good. All right, I was about to say they're cowards if they didn't do that because like the opportunity is just like ripe.
Oh, it's been a while since I just had to look that up. It's been a while since I've seen this game. But yeah, that's one of those historical things where like you can use fiction in that setting and you can get like a really fun version of it as long as you implicitly tell people straight up this isn't real, this isn't meant to be taken real, and I think the key to that is stylization. Having things that break. Like Assassin's Creed is very like clearly a video game. Like it will have like video game loading screens as part of the story, and I do think if you're going to be responsible about that, because your audience is pretty fucking stupid. Let's just be honest. You need to have characters like break the fourth wall, or you need to have that kind of Wolf of Wall Street style like stylization to some Edgar Wright level of like editing and stuff, just so people can't look at it and think it's a documentary, which is where I think a lot of these Oscar style historical fiction things they go for almost like you can view it as like a retelling of true historical events, and that's always gonna hurt people more than help. Not necessarily in the case of like in terms of like an educational system, but just as a creative, kind of setting yourself up to get a lot of shit that you might not have intended if you go for that kind of style.
See, I don't know if I agree with you 100% there. I do think there is room for it, and I do think there are stories to be told by showing historical events and really leaning on trying to be as accurate and true to what is known as possible. They're it, like, and not just for the educational value of it, though, to some extent, yeah, because sometimes media is allowed to teach us things that like our schools are not, and that's, relatively important. um, but I do think that there is some value to that, and to that challenge, and it doesn't have to be 110%. You are allowed, just as historians are, of course, are allowed to make mistakes, to have learned something incorrect, and you're allowed to do that. And it doesn't necessarily have to ruin your project. Um, but I think there is value to trying to portray something as accurately as you are able. Um, yeah, I don't know. I guess I come down on a little bit of a different side of the fence than you on that one.
No, I can see what you mean. I guess I should rephrase what I meant as just like as a precaution to like safeguard yourself. This is what I would suggest. If you are going down the route you're saying, like I said, those have value. Just be prepared to bring your A game for that. I would just say that you can't half-ass it if you're going to do what you're suggesting, because I think then you really do have to. It's a lot more of a landmine. You can walk on.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a middle ground where you can do something set historically and have it be complete fantasy, complete made up, but like still capture real things of the time. Um, there's two movies by Tarantino that I think do this fantastically. I'll start with Inglorious Bastards. So, for those that don't know, Inglorious Bastards is a work of fiction. Um, if you were unaware, Hitler was not like murdered with a hail of bullets in the middle of watching a movie. I wish, but no, that didn't happen. But Inglorious Bastards does some things historically that are like particularly impressive, and it's not that I haven't seen them in movies before, but they are done in very particular ways that are inherently fascinating. So one of the scenes that comes to mind, and this was honestly, yeah, this was 2009, so I think this was my first introduction to maybe Churchill wasn't the fucking saint the other media portrays him as. Where there's this scene in Inglourious Bastards where they're talking about the mission that the bastards are on, and there's this, the British agent that's gonna join them and stuff. And he's in a briefing with the spy master for MI6 and Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill's just there, and he's not talking much in this meeting, which is like kind of, oh, okay, this is interesting. He's just got some gravitas to him. But there's this moment where they're asking him about Himmler and what Himmler's doing, and what like Himmler's job in the Nazi power ring is. And the guy explains, well, Himmler is essentially in charge of propaganda. He believes that the best way to form the Nazi identity is through domination of the art, in particular of films that can be shown to the public en masse. And in that moment, Tarantino has Winston fucking Churchill pick up and say, so he's trying to beat the Jews at their own game. And it's like, holy fucking shit, right? But of course, that is predicated on, yes, anti-Semitism was not like a particularly Nazi thing. Anti-Semitic points of view were like well renowned and like just all over the place in so many different circles at all levels of society. A lot of the, like, again, Nazis now are the bad guys of history. Nazis in their time, before the war, were like the social lights and intellectuals. It'd be like you'd go to a party and there'd be a Nazi there and he'd be talking to everyone about these great ideas, and a lot of those ideas were ingratiated in society as a whole at that point. Anti-Semitism was a big fucking deal. That was not like the odd. They weren't the odd ones out for being anti-Semitic as fuck. Another good example of where I feel like Tarantino kind of splits the difference in here is Django Unchained. So this, you have a movie about a slave that escapes and like kind of makes a better life for himself and goes back to save his wife. And Tarantino 100% will tell you this is not based on any particular true story. This is just the idea of a black fairy tale where you've got a guy who goes to rescue a damsel in distress. But he puts a lot of things in that movie that are very accurate and very real of what people did and thought at the time. I think the scene that is absolutely the best about this is when Leonardo DiCaprio's character is parading around the skull of an old slave, and he's like pointing out parts of it to show like this part of these 3 notches here are extended on the Negro brain, and this is what makes them more submissive and less intelligent than the white man. That, like, literally word for word, that was a like fundamental belief that people had in that time. And that was like the hot trending science was these the scientific justification for racism. That was one of the ideas that existed. And it's just, I think there is value in that, in showing something of the era being completely fictitious with the overall plot, but being like incredibly accurate to some of the details and the realities of the time. I think there is tremendous value in that.
Yeah. No, I think you're
yeah.
right.
No, don't say anything else. Just yeah.
I mean, you're right. You're right. You pretty much covered all of that very comprehensively. Clip that.
Someone do it for me. I'm too lazy and I'm scared of the future. That's why I do History Month, because the future scares me, Alfie.
When's everyone gangster till Geeky Gentleman launches Future Month.
I'm so fucking down. I don't know what that would be.
Next year's Future Month.
I swear to God, if I remember, we will do it.
Read like Legion of Superhero comics and Batman Beyond and fucking talk about future technology we want.
I'm so hyped for this. Let's go.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Yeah, you write that one down. That's pretty good.
Okay. Do we have anywhere else you'd like to go with this historical topic?
I do feel like we kind of maybe skipped over the idea of these events being watered down. So it might be worth talking about just what is something that waters down these historical things. Because, you know, I kept thinking about it and I kept forgetting to bring it up, but since I was just talking about Django, I think one of the examples that comes to mind for me is a lot of old Western films, which is really unfortunate because Westerns as like a film genre are incredibly influential to like not only American cinema, but I think cinema as a whole. And they have some of like the greatest pioneering of effects and just ways of doing filmmaking and stuff. But a lot of them are predicated on really racist ideas of what the Old West was like and do a just horrendous job of showcasing, you know, what life was like in that time to the point where it's just blatantly insulting. Again, you could almost like make a good argument that wouldn't it be so much fun to make a western film in the style of pirates? I'm like, yeah, maybe, but also that's a harsher like topic to cover in a lot of ways, because just so much of what we think of as the West, inspired by westerns, is just completely inaccurate to the reality of that era of history. And it begins to be a problem. A lot of the like treatment of Native Americans is horrendously watered down, or just blatantly like shown to be a flat out lie, where like the Indians are constantly the aggressors in a lot of these movies and shit like that. It gets pretty goddamn insulting.
It's one of those things where I guess like the mentality behind downplaying these things is to make it more palatable or to further some. I don't know. It's always hard when looking at like films that are made like these by studios, and because at the end of the day, the main thing they want is profit.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess just the mentality is by watering it down, you get to have the facts, but you also don't get to have that mass appeal where even the people who kind of agree with these things, you're not pushing it so far. Because that's what like Nazis complain about on YouTube all the time, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, we don't do that. That's ridiculous. Just because we think this, you think we're all like this. So that's like the instant argument. Um, so I think maybe it's that like if we downplay these tragedies, we get to we're trying to reach that most general. We don't get to say anything, right? Because we're not taking a side. Because if you're truly taking the side of the victim, you're not going to downplay shit. You're going to really heighten that. And that's rarely done. Rarely do you get things where people like overblow the tragedies. Like that's not really something that's happened or has ever happened. Like you're never gonna get someone. I'm sure a lot of people on certain right-leaning sides would say otherwise, but it's really one of those things where like history is normally always more brutal than whatever media we portray it as. Like no matter
I got a
no,
really good example for that, if you don't mind.
yeah, go ahead, shoot.
Spielberg, when he was making Saving Private Ryan, he got to review unreleased ever to the public footage of the landing at D-Day. And if you watch the sequence just of them landing in Saving Private Ryan, it is some of the most like graphic, brutal, violent filmmaking you'll ever see. And Spielberg's talked about it where he's like, yeah, that's all based on like actual footage I saw, and that was some of the stuff that I felt was the most accessible that I could show to a widespread audience. Because a lot of the stuff he saw was apparently significantly more violent and brutal and awful to look at. So there's a good example of like one of the most violent actions ever shown on film. Nowhere near as bad as the actual event. um,
I think that one of those, the easiest way to get that example is just compare how people are shot in movies to how getting shot in real life actually works. I don't recommend anyone look up actual shootings or people being shot in real life. Please don't do that. But if you have had the unfortunate of seeing that, or even just in theory being able to picture in your head like what bullet through flesh and bone and cartilage, like there's a lot more visceral, messy. Real life is often so random, it's often that more horrificness to it. It's just like the unpredictable factors of things. You don't get that very movie moment thing where someone gets shot and there's a pause and then a lot of red appears on their shirt or some shit like that. Like, that's just not what happens in real life if you get shot. There's a lot of, and that's just like the most basic example. So then you take that outwards and then you expand that to depictions of racial violence and what people would do. Young black boys who were presumed to have been looking at white women and really just minding their own fucking business. Any other examples of like that go far harder and kind of show you like the real pit of humanity than any piece of media can really portray. I think the closest things that I've ever got to it have been books. Again, there's that degree of separation where you can read a description and then you can go look at the photo of what it's describing, and it's night and day. And I think that's something where I don't necessarily know if there's a solution to that. In terms of just like how we consume general filmmaking, or maybe that should just be a sign then that if you're going to be touching on these topics and you really want to be truthful, you shouldn't be aiming it for it to be a widespread, big success release. It shouldn't be a blockbuster type film. If you're trying to be truthful to these events, you shouldn't be going for mass appeal. If you're trying to depict violence of like how it actually is, it should be something that's smaller budget, more focused. Because hell, that's what horror movies do when they depict like those graphic instances of violence. But you don't see that apply to historical fiction, rarely if ever. And we've got the prosthetics and the makeup and the CGI now to accurately portray what horrific atrocities happen to people. But do you necessarily want to do that in the first place? Is that gonna, the people who suffered those might not want to fucking have that exist? Run the risk of, by showing it, you'll get people who watch those things for gore and those sick thrills, like enjoying actual historical tragedies for the gore, which is an entirely like kind of like skin crawling concept that I don't really want to entertain. So like, I don't know how you go about it. I don't know how about you actually solve that problem.
I don't think you should. Is I think the end of the day the answer is I don't think you really want that problem to be solved. Of how do you like portray this in like a way that is both true and profitable or whatever. It's like no, you're probably right. Like the making of these films probably shouldn't be for mass appeal. And I think it's almost like this weird accident of a moment that it happened, because as you said, a lot of it happened in the 80s and 90s as these movies kind of took off and kind of captured the nation, as it were. But I think a lot of that was like accidental. I think there was like, you know, the art house film that wanted to be made to make the statement and show the importance and pay reverence to this story. And then it just happened to also be like a wild success, and then studios got kind of studio-y about it. It's like, how many more Holocaust movies can we make? Is kind of the pattern, because I mean, it started before this, because I'm pretty sure Sophie's Choice was like an 80s film, and if I'm remembering correctly, Schindler's List is 90s. But I think Schindler's List is like the big like commercial success of a Holocaust film, because it's Spielberg, you know? Like he's just got the name for it, but that's also a very like incredibly important story to that man. So it's like this weird kind of accident of a financial success where that I just don't think that was the intent. And then it kind of just creates the beast of, oh, well, there's money to be made here. Let's make money out of this. It's fucking messy.
Yes, I think that the example with Spielberg particularly is like, well, like he needed the money. He's fucking Steven Spielberg, and by that point in his career, he'd already made like, he was already set for life. Like he didn't, Schindler's List didn't put, it certainly helped his career, without a doubt. Like it kind of what pushed him. He was already like sort of a legend, but that was like his real like.
Well,
Oh,
he
this
was like
guy,
a blockbuster
right?
filmmaker
Like,
before
this
that,
guy can
right?
make
That's like
this
kind
guy
of
makes
transitioned him to also be an
films.
art house, you know?
Right. It was like
Um,
that middle ground.
mhm.
But it wasn't one that was, I don't think, from his perspective at the very least, monetarily focused. Like as you've said, like he's spoken before in interviews about like um his relationship with that story in that film. So I think that's an example where we can be funding those stories by the people that actually um, have something to tell with them, that are actually important to them. I think there just needs to be then a lack of people writing these books that become these movies from people who are like that, so removed from it that it's entirely like, why are you writing this? And you can give as many examples in the world as like the artistic integrity of it, right? But like, don't really have like. I like to think of myself as a decent writer, Ian. If I came to you and said, "Hey, Ian, I want to write a movie about the civil rights from a black person's perspective," I would hope you'd say, "I don't know, Happy. Sure, you don't maybe want to write something with Goku instead."
No,
Like,
what I like in all fairness, I that would not be my reaction because I think that would be a little condescending. My reaction would be, okay, but are you willing to bring someone on with maybe a little bit more of a hands-on perspective about that in order to kind of help you make sure you understand the full implications of all your ideas and stuff before you go off and make that movie? And then at that point, if you tell me, no, I'm just gonna do it all on my own, I'm gonna be like, you have fun with that one, bro. I'm gonna step up to the side here.
yeah. All right, that's a nicer response than I think I would have entitled, but I think that's a very I appreciate that. I think maybe if we had more people like that, yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation to begin with. We'd actually, because I think that's also a responsibility, right? Like, okay, so you have a position where Hollywood will back you, if you're more likely to be a certain ethnicity, or I guess let's swing to comics for a second. Um, Everyone went to England looking for more Alan Moores.
Mhm.
That was the whole like British invasion. Like you're kind of seen in the comic industry if you're a Brit of a certain age, white, and like talk about philosophy a little bit. That now you're the second coming of Christ. Like you have a certain advantage there where you can use that to you have an opportunity now that no one out that someone else isn't going to get. Slam your foot in the door. Keep that door open and invite some other people in who wouldn't have had that opportunity. And if you're going to tell those stories, make sure they're involved in every way, shape, and make sure their name is on it. So that if they're going to have a story told about pain, give them the clout so that the next thing doesn't have to be. You can just make into things so that, all right, now I just want to write like a black fantasy tale about a sci-fi utopia. Like, when do
Mhm.
we ever see that show? Black futurism never gets fucking talked about outside of fucking Wakanda. That's the only thing that ever talks about that movement. And it's a really cool fucking idea. And, like, no one, like, fuck, man. Doctor Who is really guilty of this, where, like, all they ever do for time travel shit is go to the past where the black people are marginalized and then imply, oh, it's that way in the future. I don't know, Doctor Who, why don't you do a time travel story where, like, in the future, it's like, no, it's actually fucking sick. Racism's dead. Like, please, Doctor Who, please. So I don't know. There's that kind of thing with it as well, and that's what the advantage of having, like you said, someone who knows a little bit more about this and actually is of the group that you're going to be telling these stories about, at the very least, to be a proofreader. But ideally something a lot more involved in that process in a lot more direct way.
Yeah. You just made me think about this. I want to give a shout out to EC Comics all the way back in 1953 for producing the story Judgment Day, in which an astronaut visits a world where he is shown about by the peoples of the world, and they show him all the different races that they keep subjugated because they're less than, and and not as good as, and yada yada yada. And then at the end of the story, the astronaut takes off his helmet, and you realize it's a black guy from Earth, and he says they're not ready yet. They can't join the galactic society yet. They're still so backwards. And that comic caused so much shit, and the Comics Code Authority told them they couldn't publish it that way. And so they said, fuck it, we're going to publish it anyway without the goddamn approval stamp. So go fucking EC for having the balls, because again, 1953, a whole decade before the civil rights movement was even thought about, as far as like legislation goes. So, you know, fucking get on one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the guys that did Tales from the Crypt, you know, fucking schlocky horror puns right next to Afrofuturism. Let's go. Anyway, yeah, no, I think now I'm in a happier place with this episode. This is, I don't know, these are interesting discussions all the time.
Yeah,
Fascinating
yeah.
stuff.
It's geeky gentlemen, but we all wear top hats and monocles, and we put on our big boy pants and get intelligent for just over an hour. Don't worry, folks. We use all this intelligence in this 1 hour, and then we go back to being stupid and annoying our wives. Don't worry.
Yep, pretty much. I'm trying to think of like, okay, if what is, you know, what the fucking Family Guy meme was like, you guys always act like you're better than me. So like, clearly one of the months that acts like they're better than him is History Month, right? But like, what are the other two? And then what's the one that's like mad at the others?
I think the one that's mad at you is the one that's been mad at you for a while, and that's fan film reviews.
Hey, it's not my fault my fucking partner for that suddenly got busy with their life and shit, and it's like, oh, let's write scripts for weekends as opposed to doing fan film reviews. Motherfucker.
Make fan films instead. Yeah. The fan films review my pick as the Meg in that scenario.
Okay. Yeah, I'd have to figure out what the other two are then. I don't know. All right. Well, there we go. Leave a comment. What are the other two picks in that scenario alongside History Month and fan film reviews? All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for watching. I think that'll do it for this episode. Next week, I'm going to choose, and we're going to talk about, because we need something a bit lighter. We're going to talk about The Mask of Zorro, the 1999 Zorro film starring Antonio Banderas. And it's still so funny every time I think about it. Anthony Hopkins. And we're gonna talk about that. So that'll be a time and a half.
Okay.
Yeah. And hi there, Orange Sun. I hear you meowing in the background. Yeah. Well, all right. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I am the champion of the oppressed.
And we are your geeky gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.